The final test before a timeline shift does not look like progress. It looks like the old you becoming convincing again. The thoughts come back louder. The old life starts feeling emotionally important again. The familiar fear suddenly sounds wise, protective, even necessary. And if you do not understand what is happening, you will mistake the last resistance of the old reality for the truth. This is one of the most important moments in any real transformation. Not the moment you first feel inspired. Not the moment you first decide you want something new. The moment right before the shift, when everything you are beginning to outgrow tries one last time to feel real again. That is the phase most people fail to recognize, because it does not arrive dressed as sabotage. It arrives dressed as logic. It sounds like caution. It sounds like intelligence. It sounds like the voice in your head saying maybe now is not the time. Maybe you were imagining the change. Maybe the old reality still makes more sense. And because the pressure feels so personal, most people believe it. But what if the reason the old self suddenly sounds convincing again is because it knows it is losing control? This is where transformation becomes much deeper than motivation or mindset. The version of you that has been creating your current reality is not just a set of beliefs. It is a stabilized system of thought patterns, emotional habits, nervous system responses, music, and repeated interpretations of life. Over time, that system becomes what you call identity. And identity is not neutral. It wants continuity. It wants, over time, that system becomes what you call identity. And identity is not neutral. It wants continuity. It measures safety by repetition. If a thought, feeling, and reaction have happened enough times, the body begins treating them as normal. Even if they create suffering, they still feel survivable. That is why the old self can feel so convincing. It has been practiced. Dr. Joe Dispenza often explains that the body becomes the mind of the past. Repeated emotional states stop being temporary reactions and become a baseline. Stress becomes familiar. Urgency becomes familiar. Overthinking becomes familiar. The emotional chemistry of the old identity becomes so repeated that the body begins requesting it automatically. And when the body requests the old chemistry, the mind produces old thoughts to match it. This is where the final test begins. You start changing. The old reality begins losing emotional force. Your reactions soften. Your old life starts making less sense. And right when the shift is near, the old system pushes back. It does not push back because it is stronger. It pushes back because it is destabilizing. This is something almost every complex system does. Right before an old structure loses coherence, instability often increases. There is turbulence before reorganization, noise before a new order forms. In the human nervous system, that turbulence can look like old fears returning, old attachments intensifying, or old emotional loops becoming temporarily louder than they were just days before. This is why the phase can feel so confusing. You are getting quieter, clearer, less reactive, and suddenly the old thoughts return with force. The old life feels emotionally charged again. The old fear sounds intelligent again. The old self starts arguing for its own survival. And if you do not understand the mechanics of this phase, you will misread the signal. You will assume if the old fear came back, maybe I am not really changing. If the old reality feels intense again, maybe the new path is not real. If the old self sounds convincing, maybe I should go back. That is exactly how the old timeline music keeps people from leaving it. Not by overpowering them, by confusing familiarity with truth. This is why the final test is not really about external circumstances. It is about loyalty. Are you still loyal to the old emotional world just because it is known? Or are you becoming loyal to the emerging self even before that self feels fully stable? That is the threshold where timelines change, because a new reality does not stabilize the moment you want it. It stabilizes when the observer changes enough that the old reality no longer has the same emotional authority. And right before music that happens, the old observer often becomes louder. It tries to recover its influence through thoughts, fears, urges, and emotional pressure. It wants you to rebuild the old internal world before the new one can lock in. It wants to make the old life feel necessary one more time. That is the final test. Not whether you can stay positive, whether you can recognize that the return of old intensity is not the return of old truth. Because those are not the same thing. An old thought can return without being true. An old fear can get louder without being aligned. An old fear can get louder without being aligned. An old identity can fight for survival without being the self that should lead your future. Once you understand that the pressure starts looking different, it is no longer proof that the shift is fake. It becomes proof that the shift is threatening the false. That changes everything, because instead of asking, "Why is this happening again?" you begin asking a more useful question. What is the old reality trying to make me rebuild before it loses me? What makes this phase so dangerous is that the old self never presents itself honestly. It does not say, "I am your past trying to survive." It says, "I'm just being realistic." That is how it keeps its power. The old reality does not usually pull you back through obvious darkness. It pulls you back through arguments that sound reasonable enough to trust. It takes your familiar fears and dresses them in the language of caution. It takes your old wounds and disguises them as wisdom. It takes your nervous system's discomfort with the unknown and translates it into thoughts sound intelligent, mature, and protective. This is why the final test feels so personal. It knows your voice. It knows your patterns. It knows what kind of thought will make you hesitate. And because it speaks in the language of self-P protection, people often mistake it for intuition. But intuition expands music you. The old self contracts you. That distinction matters more than most people realize. The familiar mind does not need to be correct to stay in power. Only music needs to sound believable, long enough to get you to rebuild the same emotional structure. If it can make you react the old way, if it can get the body back into the old chemistry, then the old reality regains coherence. That is how the cycle survives. This is where nervous system survival response becomes central. The body is not just listening to your thoughts. It is actively shaping them. When the unknown approaches, when the old timeline begins losing stability, the nervous system often interprets the shift as threat. Not because the new reality is dangerous, but because it is unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity to a conditioned body can feel like danger even when it is actually expansion. Music. So the body tightens. The thoughts intensify. The old emotional memories become easier to access, and suddenly the old selfie sounds authoritative again. This is not 7 minutes, 57 seconds, random. It is the survival system trying to preserve continuity. For years, the body may have lived inside a familiar emotional environment. Stress, urgency or disappointment, vigilance, fear of loss, fear of change, fear of hope itself. Those states became chemically normal. The body knew how to survive inside them. They may have been painful, but they were known. So when a new timeline starts forming, one that requires more openness, more coherence, more internal trust, the body can react as if you are leaving something essential behind. Because in a way, you are leaving behind the emotional architecture that built the old reality. That architecture does not vanish without resistance. This is why the final test often looks like the return of the very patterns you thought you had already outgrown. The same fear resurfaces. The same attachment reappears. The same urge to shrink, to overthink, to go back, to doubt everything comes rushing in as if it has been waiting for the exact moment when you were most vulnerable. But what you are actually seeing is not proof that the old self is still right. You are seeing proof that it is still available. And availability is not destiny. This is one of the most important distinctions in transformation. A pattern can still be available in the nervous system without needing to direct your future. A fear can still appear without needing to become reality. An old identity can still speak without needing to lead. The problem is that most people have never learned how to separate the presence of a pattern from the authority of a pattern. So they assume, if I'm feeling this, it must be true. If the fear came back, it must mean something. If the old thought sounds strong, I should listen. But intensity is not always truth. Sometimes intensity is simply the volume of the past, trying to survive the future. This is why the final test is less about what thoughts appear, and more about what you believe those thoughts mean. If you believe they are truth, you will obey them. If you obey them, you will recreate the old chemistry. If you recreate the old chemistry, the old identity regains power. And if the old identity regains power, the old timeline gets one more chance to hold you. That is the trap, not the thought itself, the interpretation. The old self becomes dangerous when you mistake it for wisdom. And this is why a real timeline shift demands discernment. You have to learn the difference between guidance and regression, between true intuition and old survival logic, between the calm truth of the emerging self and the dramatic persuasion of the dissolving one. The dissolving self sounds urgent. The emerging self sounds clear. The dissolving self pulls you backward. The emerging self opens you. The dissolving self wants emotional intensity because intensity is how it keeps reality feeling real. The emerging self does not need the same amount of noise to know what is true. That is why the old reality gets louder before it disappears, because noise is one of its last remaining tools. And once you see that, you stop asking whether the old voice is returned. You start asking whether it still has your belief. That is the real test. Because what comes next depends entirely on whether you can feel the old pressure without translating it into obedience. And this is where the body becomes the battlefield. Because the old reality does not survive through thoughts alone. It survives through sensation. A thought becomes convincing when the body agrees with it. Fear becomes believable when the chest tightens, the stomach contracts, the breathing shifts, and the nervous system starts generating the same chemistry it used to produce inside the old life. In that moment, the past does not feel like memory. It feels like truth. This is why the final test before a timeline shift is so hard to recognize while it is happening. The old self is not just speaking in your mind, it is activating your body. It is trying to turn familiar sensation into familiar identity. It is trying to make you feel the old reality strongly enough that you rebuild it before the new one becomes stable. Dr. Joe Dispenza describes this in a very precise way. The body becomes the unconscious mind. After enough repetition, emotions stop being temporary states and become memorized programs. Music. Stress becomes baseline. Longing becomes baseline. Fear becomes baseline. Urgency becomes baseline. The body starts generating the same emotional environment even before the conscious mind has chosen what to believe. And once the body generates that environment, the mind quickly produces thoughts to match it. This is how the old timeline defends itself. The body remembers the old reality. The body recreates the old chemistry. The mind interprets that chemistry as evidence, and the old self suddenly sounds real again. This is why the final test is not only mental, it is somatic. The old life is trying to make itself emotionally real one last time through the nervous system. It is trying to prove that the familiar future still belongs to you by flooding your system with old sensations until you collapse into the same interpretation again. That is why the fear can return so suddenly. That is why the doubt can feel physical. That is why the urge to go back can feel less like a thought and more like a pull. You are not just hearing the old self. You are feeling it attempt to re-enter the body as home. And if you do not understand that, you will assume the body is telling you the truth. But the body is often telling you what it has memorized. There is music a difference. What the body memorized may have kept you safe once. It may have helped you survive an old environment, an old wound, an old version of yourself that needed constant vigilance, self-PP protection, music, or emotional control. But what helped you survive the old reality will often become the exact thing that prevents you from entering a new one. Because survival and expansion do not use the same internal language. The survival system wants predictability. The emerging self wants coherence. And those are not always the same music thing. Predictability says, go back to what you know. Coherence says, stay with what is true even if it is new. That is the line dividing old timelines from new ones. This is why manifestation through non-reaction is so powerful. When the old thought appears and the body starts producing the music familiar chemistry, but you do not obey it, something radical happens. The body begins learning that activation does not have to become identity. The nervous system begins discovering that an old sensation can rise without determining the future. The observer stays present long enough for the past to be felt without being rebuilt. That changes everything, because once the body stops proving the old thought with the same intensity, the old thought loses authority. It may still appear,